Hello, I'm Marites Vitug. Welcome to Southeast Asia Speaks. This is the show where I get to interview resource persons and newsmakers on issues affecting the region. I will be speaking to Gregory Poling, a senior fellow for Southeast Asia of the CSIS, or Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. He's also director of the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative. We will be talking to Greg about the U.S. policy in Southeast Asia and as well as the US Philippines alliance. It's now the 70th year of the US Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty. Thank you so much, Greg, for making time for this interview.
Hi, Marites. Great to talk to you.
Yes, so it's quite timely. Maybe first let's look a bit into the future. So for the rest of the year and 2022, what will be the focus of the US agenda here in Southeast Asia? Is going to be still the pandemic or China or both?
I think China is the subtext to a lot, if not most, of what the U.S. does. But the Biden administration seems to understand that the U.S. has to show leadership in the pandemic right now. We're facing two unprecedented global challenges, the short-term one being the pandemic and the longer-term one being climate change. And that if the U.S. wants to compete with China, if it wants to show that it's still worthy of global leadership, then it needs to do that by leading on these two issues. And if it doesn't get the pandemic right, if it doesn't provide the necessary support, both financial and in direct delivery of vaccines that the region needs, nothing else it tries to do on the China challenge is going to get much support.
So you see this as both equally important, but one is short term, the other is longer term. And how about, yeah, can you explain that?
I think that what the administration gets, and maybe its predecessor didn't get as much, is that the U.S.'s real strength lies in its ability to influence and bring along other partners and allies, right? The U.S. can theoretically tap a network of allies and partners who willingly want to support the same kind of rules and efforts that the U.S. undertakes, and China can't match that. But in order for the U.S. to leverage that power, that well of global support, it has to bring a positive agenda. It can't just come to partners and allies in the region bashing China. It has to come and say, here's what working with the U.S. delivers and has delivered. And so at a time of a global pandemic, obviously, it's not really about competing with China. It's just about showing that the U.S. can deliver public goods. And the rest can, in many ways, flow from that.
How about the US partnership with Quad, or at least these four countries? We've been waiting. They announced, I think, early this year that they would be distributing vaccines. They'll do this counter diplomacy or counterweight to China. What has happened? And what are your expectations of Quad?
Yeah, the Biden administration has definitely made the Quad a centerpiece of its engagement in the Indo-Pacific, more than certainly the Trump administration did. And that is because the Biden administration recognizes that while ASEAN is vital, ASEAN is not capable nor willing to deal with any politically sensitive or difficult challenges. So whether it's the pandemic right now, or the South China Sea, or the Mekong, or emerging technology competition, or any of the other issues down the line, it's not going to happen through ASEAN, although it might happen with individual ASEAN members. The Quad is far more like-minded on these issues, and the Quad, particularly with the Indians and the Japanese on board, have an enormous amount of capacity in the region, be it as donors or, in the Indian case, as major manufacturers, or as largest manufacturers of vaccines. So we can, in theory, get things done. And the Quad's first real test is the pandemic. So in March, when you had the first virtual leaders summit of the four heads of state, their big deliverable was this announcement of 1 billion vaccines to be produced in India. So American developed vaccines produced in India with Japanese funding and Australian logistics support. And that billion vaccines was supposed to be delivered by 2022. What they didn't foresee, and I guess what nobody could have foreseen, is that barely a month later, India would get slammed by the third wave. And suddenly, almost overnight, it felt like India had the highest caseload in the world. And the Indian government, as frankly I think any government would have, turned its domestic manufacturing capacity inward. And that didn't just sideline the Quad vaccine initiative. It slowed down vaccine distribution through the COVAX initiative globally. So COVAX is now tens of millions of doses behind its schedule. And I'm hoping when the Quad leaders meet later this month, and I think just 9 days, they're going to announce a re-energization of that effort, because they really need to. Again, if you don't get the vaccines working, nothing else matters.
So, Greg, let's go back a bit to the visits of Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Vice President Kamala Harris to the region. Before these visits, the narrative here was that the U.S. has been neglecting Southeast Asia, and then came Defense Secretary Austin's visit. He only came to 3 countries: Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines. I know you've written about this, but can you tell us why? Why these 3 countries only?
Well, because the secretary can't be everywhere. You can't go to all 10 countries in one trip. And so if you're I think 3 is kind of the max for what you can possibly do in a week and have any real time on the ground, any real deliverables in any of them. So if you're going to pick 3 countries, the 3 that are most strategically aligned with the United States, and I would argue most important for U.S. interests, are Singapore, Vietnam, and the Philippines. The Philippines and Vietnam are the 2 who are clearly most strategically aligned with the United States when it comes to China, and are most likely to get on board with U.S.-led initiatives on that front, especially in the South China Sea. Singapore is the most important partner at the moment for U.S. access. Without the access provided by Singapore, the U.S. Navy can't function the way the U.S. Navy has for the last 30 years in the region. So you've got the most important strategic partner in Singapore, the most important and oldest ally in the Philippines, and the kind of rising partner, the one who shares your concerns about China the most, in Vietnam. I think those 3 made perfect sense. It would be nice if he could also go to Thailand and also go to Indonesia and also go to Malaysia, but he can't go everywhere in 1 week.
Yes, and then this visit was followed by Vice President Kamala Harris's trip. But this time she left out the Philippines. But still, why?
Yeah. So I think that there are 2 reasons there, and they probably fed into each other. So one, again, if you're setting out the vice president, you're looking for deliverables. Where are you likely to get deliverables, real progress on issues? Well, it was likely to come in Singapore. They knew they could get something. They knew they could make these announcements on supply chains and climate change and cyber working groups. And then in Vietnam, where you had the opening of Peace Corps Vietnam, which they've been working on for 30 years, signing the new lease of a new embassy, which they've been working on for 30 years, you could get these deliverables. It wasn't clear that you were going to get deliverables like that in a trip to Indonesia or Thailand. And you couldn't go to Malaysia because they're trapped in the middle of political turmoil. And then the other more kind of pedestrian reason, the nuts and bolts of it, is those were the only 2 countries that had reasonable COVID levels at that moment. It's really, really hard to imagine how you could have sent the vice president to Indonesia or the Philippines, given the spiking Delta numbers at that time. And she probably couldn't even have gone to Vietnam had she waited 2 more weeks.
Okay, I think my internet has been a bit unstable. But anyway, some were making the comment that the vice president had no foreign policy experience or expertise. So was her visit more symbolic than substantial?
I mean, I guess it could be both, but yeah, so Secretary Austin's visit was far more substantive in a way, right? He came with the big speech in Singapore and then the real deliverables in Hanoi and Manila, saving the VFA in the Philippines and this agreement on legacies of war in Vietnam. The vice president's trip had deliverables, but they were less drastic. What they were really trying to do was get her exposure. She does not have foreign policy experience, but if you're going to get foreign policy experience, the most important region to do it is Asia. And so it certainly makes sense that her second trip out was to the region.
So you think these 2 significant visits erase the narrative that Southeast Asia is no longer a neglected part of the world by the US?
I don't think it erased anything. I think it bought some time. So you had, Austin's visit was very well received. And then right after that, Secretary Blinken had the week-long engagements with the ASEAN foreign ministers through the ASEAN Regional Forum, East Asia Summit, Ministerial Meeting, and the Mekong meetings, and then Harris. So it's been a steady drumbeat. I think the real key, though, is still, can Biden at the Quad meeting later this month deliver a big win on vaccines? And then does he engage virtually in the East Asia Summit at the end of October in ways that are very well received? No single one of these visits was going to fix anything. But again, it bought some time. It gave, I think, it convinced most, not all, but most journalists and government officials in Southeast Asia to give the administration a few more months to get its house in order.
Yes. Now, let's turn our attention, Greg, to the 70th year of the Philippine-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty. Defense Secretary Lorenzana recently visited Washington, D.C. It has been there's a new tone, an emphasis apparently on maritime dialogues. Anyway, you were there. I mean, you monitored the visit. Can you talk to us about what this meeting with Austin and Lorenzana, what did it accomplish?
Yeah, I hosted the secretary at CSIS for his public speech, and I met with him 3 times during the trip. It is clear that a corner's been turned, or it feels like a corner's been turned, compared to where we were in early 2019 with the threat to the BFA. When Secretary Lorenzana made his public statements with me at CSIS, and he said that he wanted a review of the Mutual Defense Treaty, he's been saying that consistently for 3 years now. I mean, he first said that at the end of 2018, and for all the same reasons. So he wanted clarification on the scope in the South China Sea, which he got, and he has been continually getting. He wants more clarity on what the U.S. and the Philippines can do together in the so-called gray zone, confronting Chinese Coast Guard and especially its maritime militia, which we still need to work on. And I think that is one of the goals of this maritime dialogue that you heard him announce with Austin. And then the third thing is that he wants more support from the U.S. on the AFP modernization plan, which I think is right, and the U.S. should certainly get on board with. And the U.S. has been clear, I think, at least behind closed doors, that if that's going to happen, then, in fact, if both that and the NBT clarification are going to be real, the key to both is EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. The U.S. cannot protect Filipino troops from Guam. We have to be in the Philippines to do it. That's what EDCA was supposed to do. And the most efficient way to upgrade Philippine defense capabilities, at least base infrastructure, is to build it at the EDCA site so that when the U.S. transfers those to the Philippines at the end of the agreement in 10 years, the Philippines has already built infrastructure to use. So the big deliverable for me out of the 4 points that Lorenzana and Austin had in their meeting last weekend was restarting the infrastructure construction at the EDCA sites, which has been stalled since President Duterte came to office.
Okay, so these next steps in the U.S. alliance, Philippine alliance, you said that Lorenzana has been asking for a review, has been repeatedly saying this. And then U.S. has always been assuring the Philippines of its ironclad commitment, even in the South China Sea. So is this very clear at this point that the U.S. will come to the rescue of the Philippines if there is conflict in the South China Sea? Is that very clear now in this? You said we have turned a corner.
It is hard to see how it could be any clearer given what we have to work with. So you've had Secretary Pompeo, then Secretary Blinken, Secretary Austin. They have all repeatedly said that Article 5 of the U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty applies to any attack on Philippine armed forces, public vessels, or aircraft in the South China Sea. Doesn't matter where they are, doesn't matter if they're on land or on water. If Filipino troops are attacked, the U.S. is obligated to meet the common danger under the treaty. Now, the problem with that is capacity. The Philippines has an obligation under Article 2 of the treaty to self-help, to mutually meet dangers. EDCA is part of that. When the Philippine Supreme Court ruled EDCA constitutional in early 2016, it did so explicitly because it said that EDCA was a requirement of Article 2. The Philippines had to provide the U.S. a platform from which to fulfill its obligations. If we don't have that, and if we don't have pre-planning and contingency plans and interoperability and all the things you need to effectively work the alliance, then commitment only gets you so far. So right now, I think both sides agree on what the commitments are, and all, you know, our hearts are all in the right place. Now it's time to do the work to make sure we can actually implement it.
Yes, Greg, maybe just concretely, what do you expect from this maritime dialogue? This is the first time I'm hearing also of this desire for a maritime dialogue between the two allies. Concretely, what do you expect from this?
Well, I'm guessing. Obviously, we don't have any details yet. I can tell you what's needed. We clearly need better contingency planning so that the next time there is a gray zone threat, China tries to build something at Scarborough Shoal, or again tries to blockade resupply of the Sierra Madre at Ayungin Shoal, that we can very quickly put into place plans that we already have. We saw this play out in 2014, the last time the Chinese blockaded the Sierra Madre, when the U.S. and the Philippines moved in lockstep during that operation. It's unclear we could do that today because that coordination has atrophied under the Duterte government. So we clearly need to put in place more clear plans and rules of engagement, definitions for what is and isn't, gray zone activity and what we would do, all so that when the next crisis comes, we already have our plans ready and can move together as allies. The last thing you want is to try to figure out what your response is supposed to be in the middle of the crisis. And particularly because China now is in a much, much stronger position than it was during the Aquino government, right? China now operates from 3 air and naval bases in the Spratlys and is closer to all the Philippine bases than the Philippines itself is. It's much closer to the Sierra Madre than Western Command in Puerto Princesa, for instance.
Do you think, Greg, I don't know if this was covered also in the conversation, in the visit of Lorenzana, because the Coast Guard, how role of Coast Guard both countries? Here in the Philippines, the Coast Guard is under a civilian department, but I understand in the U.S. the Coast Guard is also reports also to the Defense Department. Can you please clarify?
Not exactly. So the Coast Guard in the U.S., like a lot of Coast Guards, including most in the region, has a dual purpose. So in peacetime, the Coast Guard is a civilian law enforcement agency under the command of the Department of Homeland Security, just like Philippine Coast Guard is. In times of war, the Coast Guard can be, does tend to get called up as a branch of the armed services. That, doesn't happen much. As far as I know, there's never been any significant use of the U.S. Coast Guard as an armed service branch since World War II. So when we talk about Coast Guard cooperation now, when a USS Coast Guard cutter shows up to the Philippines for training or whatever, those are civilian on civilian. Those are law enforcement cooperation. And there's a significant role for that. I mean, you are seeing the U.S. Coast Guard play more of a role, but let's be honest, the U.S. Coast Guard doesn't have enough ships to patrol the U.S. exclusive economic zone. At best, over the next decade, we might see 2 U.S. Coast Guard cutters at any one time in the entire Indo-Pacific based out of Guam. So while I think it'll do valuable training and interoperability work, it's not going to be a huge component of what the U.S. is doing in the South China Sea, nor is it going to directly engage in law enforcement activity in the South China Sea. It has neither the capacity nor any legal right to do that.
So it seems like joint patrols between the Philippine Coast Guard and the U.S. Coast Guard is not something that is feasible. But of course, Duterte has not approved of joint patrols in the West Philippine Sea. But eventually, do you see that happening? Let's say if there'll be a new administration here in the Philippines and it's more open. In terms of capacity, can the U.S. and the Philippines Coast Guards do joint patrols in West Philippine Sea or South China Sea?
Yeah, I mean, I seriously doubt it. Again, the U.S. doesn't have ships to spare. It has Navy ships to spare. It doesn't have Coast Guard ships to spare to engage in patrols in the South China Sea. You could put U.S. ship riders on Philippine Coast Guard ships for training, but that's not quite the same thing. And at the end of the day, I don't think that it would really solve the problem anyway. Sending out a couple of U.S. and Philippine Coast Guard ships on joint patrol to try to chase off what is now literally 300 or more Chinese militia vessels every single day in the Philippine EEZ, that's a hopeless endeavor. You're never going to successfully defend Philippine rights in Philippine waters with armed vessels on patrol. The answer has to be a combination of shore-based and unmanned platforms, satellite platforms to keep an eye on the Chinese, but more importantly, diplomatic and economic pressure to convince the Chinese to back off. If you look at what's happened since the Whitsun Reef standoff earlier this year, when the Philippine Coast Guard spotted over 200 Chinese militia boats at Whitsun Reef or Julian Felipe Reef, the Philippine Coast Guard has seriously stepped up its patrols, and that's been a good symbolic action. The Cabra has gone out, the PCG Cabra, at least 4 times that we've monitored. But each time, it's drawing off maybe 4 or 5 Chinese militia boats, and the other 195 or so get away. So that's a hopeless game of whack-a-mole.
Okay. So, well, on that note, still, we're hopeful because there's a new tone now between our Defense Department and the U.S. Defense Department on achieving specific deliverables in this maritime conversation. And as you said, Greg, there's also one item about revisioning. They're going to have a new vision statement. So that's new as well. And were there any details shared to you while on that visit?
Not yet. I mean, I think we can see what parallels this might look like if you look at the review that the U.S.-Japan defense alliance went through in the 1990s after the end of the Cold War, which led to a new set of defense guidelines for the U.S.-Japan alliance in the mid-90s. And then we did that again in the 2000s. The most recent set of U.S.-Japan defense guidelines came out in 2015. There is no such U.S.-Philippines defense guidelines. And these would set out things like what our shared goals are, how we're going to get there, what procurement should look like, what contingencies and planning would look like. All of this kind of getting both defense departments and both militaries pointing in the same direction, so that we're both cognizant of what the challenges are, and we both agree on how we're going to work together to meet them. Otherwise, the alliance ends up seesawing back and forth with every new administration in both capitals, and that's unsustainable.
Okay, sorry, a little bit of technical glitch on my end, but thank you so much, Greg. It was really enlightening because at least now we have something to look forward to, a fresh take on the U.S.-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty and Security Relationship. So on that note, to our viewers and listeners, thank you for joining us in this conversation, and we hope to speak again to Greg in the future. He's been such dutiful follower of maritime events here and U.S. and China relations here in Southeast Asia. Thank you so much, Greg.
Thank you, Maritas.
Yes. Bye.